Hi, and welcome to today's Health Communication Summary Lecture. Today we're not actually going to be talking about anything from your book. I thought we could use a little bit of a break, and I wanted to explore some topics that kind of overlap with things we've already talked about in terms of risk and crisis communication, and some of the stuff we've been talking about a little bit more recently in terms of media and technology. So I picked up these two, I guess you could call them articles. One one's more of a research report, though really it's a report of somebody's research in a much more summary, a much more comprehensive summary. I want to start off by talking, I think, about this article, Understanding the Risk, What Frightens Rarely Kills. When you read it, you'll notice that it's a little bit dated. This is something from 2007 that saw a journalist. I mean, well, technically he's a risk communication consultant, but he's speaking to journalists. This is a transcript of things that he said, which is why if you notice, he's got like somewhere in here, it's kind of confusing because out of nowhere there's like this Q&A on page, let me just check here. Yeah, on page 62, where a journalist says something and then Sandman says something. I think this is something that he talked about to journalists, and then it's published in Neiman Reports. And so this is a sort of his opinion about how journalists need to cover different types of crises and risks and deal with these types of things. And let me just say up front that what I like about this is that he seems to actually have a good grasp on how the public tends to respond to news media reports of different health risks and crises. But what I don't like is I actually am not quite sure I agree with all of his recommendations, and actually this is something that I'm hoping to kind of stir up on the discussion board to get your opinions on it. But let me just start with what I like about this. First of all, he's making comments, though he doesn't say it directly, he's making comments about how people respond emotionally during different types of risks and crises that are being reported in the news. You'll notice there's even actually a very interesting sort of summary of some stuff that happened like back when Spanish flu was making the rounds. But he is talking mostly now about the avian flu that, if you'll remember, really dominated the news cycle several years ago, maybe around 2000, well, maybe around 2007, actually, maybe around 2007, 2008. But I think that the types of things that he's saying about that are also applicable to many other different types of risks or crises that we see reported. For instance, we can think about this in terms of the West Virginia water crisis that happened when there was a chemical spill in the water. It's sort of a more local issue. And then the news coverage of Ebola, even a little bit more recently. And what he's saying is that people don't really respond to the information about the risk or crisis that you're reporting on. What he's actually arguing, and I think he actually says it kind of best on the first page, page 59, is that people's assessment of risks and their assessments of crises usually are in response to their emotions, which is backwards than I know which is a little bit different than how we usually think about the order of things. We think about, oh, well, we thought about something and that made us feel something. What he's actually arguing here, and I do agree with, and it's consistent actually with a lot of research on political communication too, is that actually people make a lot of sense out of their feelings. And what they'll do is that if they're feeling something, then they'll infer from that what's going on, and they'll actually look for information that confirms those feelings. So if people are feeling fearful, if something evokes a lot of fear, right, then they will respond, and he uses the word like outrage. Whereas if people are feeling calm, then they'll sort of dismiss a risk. Then they won't overestimate the risk. On the contrary, they could actually underestimate the risk. I'm sorry, I have a little, I have some phlegm. Feeling verklempt, so sorry. So here on 59, he says, for the most part, people don't get upset because they think something's dangerous. It's much truer that people think something's dangerous because they're upset. It's similarly untrue that people are calm because they think something's safe. It's much truer that people think something is safe because they are calm. And I really do think that there's a lot of truth there. In fact, Another thing that he said that was really resonated and is connected to this on page 62, he talks about how the relationship between information and emotion is that strong emotion provokes bias information seeking. So I already sort of touched on this a minute ago. Essentially what he's arguing here is that, and then once people are feeling an emotion, particularly if it's a strong one, then that's going to seek them to go and find more information, which is normal. Our emotions are there to sort of motivate us to do things. That's why we have them. But he's saying that just because people are seeking out information, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get good information. And even if they get good information, adding another layer to this, even if they get great information, they are very likely to process it in a biased way, where they're going to pick out details that resonate with them, resonate their emotional experience, and then they're going to be more likely to ignore things that don't resonate with them. So all of these things, I think, are 100% true. I also agree with some of the strategies he's recommending, which I'll let you read on your own, as far as how news organizations can actually make people feel more fearful, experience more outrage in response to a risk that maybe they should feel outrage for. Likewise, he makes some interesting comments on what you should do if you're actually trying to sort of, what he called it, outrage management. If there's a lot of fear going on and what you're trying to do is squelch that fear, then for instance what you would need to do is report boring facts and details, and eventually people will sort of like calm down and really lose interest, and by losing interest, lose some of the negative emotional valence that's attached to something. I guess my problem is that given that he is speaking to journalists, I'm not necessarily sure that I'm not necessarily sure that there's a really good justification for what he's arguing about times when journalists actually need to pump up fear. Certainly I understand the issues he talks about, even, again, not him, but the excerpt from somebody's book about the Spanish flu and when the government's hiding certain details about different things. But my concern, I think, and this is a risk communication issue that I'd like to talk more about, is that I'm not sure who gets to make the decisions, right, about what gets to be pumped up, if you will, which risks get to be pumped up and which don't. I'm not saying that nobody should make those determinations. I'm just not sure why he should. But also, I think what I'm concerned about is that if we follow these guidelines, if our journalists follow these guidelines and decide that, particularly if they're working for a for-profit organization that relies on entertainment value, they need readership. They need eyeballs to go to their website or to read their newspaper, then there's going to be a lot of incentive to evoke outrage, to evoke fear, precisely because it'll motivate more people to read it. That is more interesting and less boring than something that doesn't pose a lot of risk. But the problem is if we trump up something to help people understand that it's a risk, maybe even overestimate that risk, then even if the only harm in that is causing a little bit of panic, I do think it makes people overlook risks that they actually should be concerned with. And he does open this discussion sort of acknowledging that this is a problem, that people do tend to overestimate the risks to things that aren't really risks, relatively speaking, and then kind of downplay the things that they really should be concerned about. We've talked about this before as far as even the different cancer campaigns and things like that, where things that get a lot of media exposure tend to make people overestimate the risk to them. But the problem is that there are things that don't get media exposure that could actually be more problematic that people aren't paying any attention to. A little bit of this is an ethical debate, and I realize that, but I think it's an interesting discussion. And I'd also like to sort of point out one little thing that wasn't in this reading, but just like one more theory that I think is relevant. There's something called exemplification theory. It's a theory of mass communication that talks about how when people are given an exemplar, which is another word for an example that's very emotional, they'll tend to base their estimates of their own risk according to that exemplar, even if you give them real hard statistics about their likelihood of a particular risk. The example I give in other classes is JAWS. When people went to see JAWS, which you could look at as an exemplar of shark attacks, right? They would overestimate the chances of ever being that they would ever be in a shark attack. Okay, the reason is because that example is so emotional, right? It sticks with you. It's something that visually it's even hard to get rid of. And this theory goes that even when you, in the same news article, for instance, present somebody with their chances of being in a shark attack, real statistics based on however many people have been bitten by a shark in the past, versus somebody's personal experience, which would be that exemplar, that the exemplar will always win, that people are going to weight that heavier. And I think that's a lot of what the news media does to sort of boost our risks is when we see these personal examples. They're much more entertaining and they are much more memorable, but somewhat problematically, they can they do have a tendency to affect our emotions in such a way that we overestimate our risks, even when there's actual base rate accurate information about what the actual risk is. Okay, so let's talk about that more later. The only thing I wanted to say about this one, the communication currents thing, which I love. This is an article from the National Communication Association, which is an organization I belong to. It's a bunch of academics, and what they've tried to do with this publication is basically take some of this like grittier, jargony research and just break it down a little bit so that we can use it for our classes and stuff like that. So I really like this. This was this was a study about information seeking of cancer news on the internet. And as we've already talked about before, one of the great things about the internet is like it gives people more opportunities to find out health information. In some ways, that's very empowering. But what they were concerned about is the idea that people might have access to a lot of information, but how good is that information at actually helping their emotional and physical well-being? So what they did was they basically did, we call it a content analysis. They collected during a particular time span many articles by online news sites. It looks like MSNBC, CNN, Yahoo, Google, you know, the big ones. And anything that came up dealing with cancer, they would collect that, and then they analyzed it to try to find out different things. One of the things they were really interested in is how ambiguous the information was, because what we know is that people will go seeking information about things like cancer because they have high levels of uncertainty. Humans in general do not like uncertainty. Being uncertain about things is very uncomfortable. It's very worrying. Getting back to emotion again, right? It provokes a lot of anxiety. So what they wanted to know is if all this access to new media and all this cancer information that came out was actually something that was helping reduce people's level of uncertainty and anxiety and giving them practical tips. And what they found was really the information out there is pretty ambiguous, suggesting that maybe people aren't getting a lot of information that's going to reduce uncertainty. In fact, it could even increase uncertainty in some cases. For instance, they talked about how we discovered that nearly 2/3 of cancer news contain uncertainty. It was because reports of the research are inherently uncertain and or probabilistic. So in other words, they would say things that don't really have like very concrete terms, like chemotherapy may be ineffective in some cases. Well, that doesn't really tell you anything about chemotherapy. Or it doesn't give people, for instance, the odds of success or anything like that. And again, going back to what we just talked about before, I don't know if it's reporters' job to do that. I really don't. I think it may be even dangerous to say that it is their job. But having said that, one of the downsides of being sort of ambiguous about things like this is that it could actually raise uncertainty. And when people are looking for information, they might actually find things that provoke more anxiety. Excuse me. And so they're sort of saying that, well, accuracy is very important. But of course, thinking again about the larger picture when it comes to journalism, that might not be something that journalists even want to do if, again, their job is to entertain people or make sure that people come to their website so they can sell advertisements. It's a very complicated thing. They're not necessarily saying that this is a terrible thing either, right? Not forget whether it's their job or not. They actually make the suggestion that maybe this is the type of thing that will prompt people to go and seek out information in places that they could get the information from, right? Because they can get certain information that'll lead them along. They can get information about who else to contact or things to look out for, even if they're not getting all of the hard facts that they want. And so that could actually be a positive thing. And as I say at the end, it just simply means that those receiving the information might need some guidance to make the best use of this information. And I think that's a really nice way to end this, because it is sort of the job of health communicators at this point. Even if the journalists don't get it right and the CDC doesn't get it right and the doctors don't get it right, it's a job of health communication to sort of like streamline this process. And I do think this is actually going back to one more topic we've talked about before, a health literacy issue too, right? The more that we can increase people's overall health literacy about how to navigate the internet, how to navigate their medical how to navigate medical facilities and insurance, right? All of these things will hopefully result in a better health consumer. So that's our job. Okay, I think that covers it. Thank you. See you later.